Hello, my name is Brad Feuerhelm. I'm the author of a book called Dein Kampf that Mack released in September of 2019. And I've been invited to do a live talk about the book and about the process of making Dein Kampf. From the cover, particularly the orange and blue cover, part of that sentimental sort of idea that enforced sentimentality that I had put myself under, either through music or through my foreknowledge or whatever, kind of comes out a little bit in the cover of Dein Kampf. The orange and the blue of the cover are actually from an AGFA paper box. I think it's a Portrait Rapid Classic 118 or something like that. Something I used to print on a long time ago, and it's this idea that if you would pick up that reference from that, it would allow you to enter into obliquely that atmosphere of of sentimental nostalgia or whatever, no matter where you were from. I'm like I said, I'm from Wisconsin. I don't I don't particularly have any sort of natural inclination towards the nostalgias of the German Empire and or even the really strange nostalgias of people who lived under, particularly East Berlin and communism and so on, and being at the needle point besides Cuba of a a massive divide between ideological pursuits in the quote unquote West. So the cover itself is kind of an indicator of that. There's also something else about the cover is that the slope, I'll call it, of the blue on the cover also had a bit to do with this kind of consternation I feel about ideological prowess or being involved in ideological struggles. If you look at it, one of the original ideas I had was to put a sort of circular symbol on the incline of what I call the slope of the cover, and that was going to reflect a sort of Camus and Sisyphean way of looking at pushing up the rock of the hill of failure, and not necessarily about suicide and Durkheim and suicide or whatnot, but more about the struggle of finding oneself at a place with ideological disorder. And I took the circular bit out and just left the incline on there with a sharp drop off in terms of the blue on the cover of the book, thinking that perhaps that might be enough to sort of deal with things. So going through the book itself, apart from the cover and the nostalgia and how I actually made photographs, all of this, supremely 35 millimeter black and white photography, November 2017, Berlin, which is gray. There's no other way to explain it. And the book kind of leads off, I've kind of put numbers on the pages, but the book kind of leads off with a sort of fake character. There are three fake characters in the book who are all women, who are appropriated elements from the city and from posters. And frankly, women tend to get used more on posters throughout the city for selling things, and that's obviously a massive issue. It's a historical issue that women are sort of used as a their bodies are used as a selling point. But that wasn't my fascination. My fascination was to suggest a type of person. It was just to suggest a person that wasn't real, the simulacra of which that plays out throughout the book, of making a false impression about what is real, what is not real, in terms of the historical sort of evaluation of a body of work. The second page itself, and this is probably one of the more important pages in terms of design, which Morgan at Mack was really great about, but it saw, I think, quite clearly that the physicality of having a blank page between pages 2 and pages 5, meaning that 3 and 4 are both blank, created a sort of wall in between two pictures of what are essentially satellite communication towers in the Berlin landscape. One is the actual it's the actual tower itself, and the second is a reflection of the tower in a window across. So you have in between the two, you have a white page that literally acts as a wall in Berlin, between communication, communication of ideology, and so on. So it's a physical device that, I think if you don't register it at first, will make sense when you go through the book. Following through, you see things like, pages 6 and 7 are sort of, there's a mosque that's involved and another satellite, television, sort of satellite on the opposite page of the mosque. And the mosque, it's very near to the station of Kutbusser Tour. And the idea here is to play a little bit on ideological references to the current times, meaning Islam, the state of Islam, not only in Germany, which, if you're following, what's happening in Germany with the rise of the right wing, and some of you are, that Islam plays a big part in that, as does mass immigration. And so these sort of elements, these symbols, and the symbolic architecture that represent, fear, and a media spin on people and their ideological form, which can be used as a bulwark to fight against or for, um, ideological landscape setting, in effect. And my position, just to be clear, is not anti-Islam. It's not anti. It's anti everything. If I'm really honest, because I don't subscribe to any of this, and for whatever popular or unpopular reasons. So if you follow that through and you see the sort of TV tower and the way that, on the next page, the TV satellite, the way that things are played out on page 7, you'll start to notice grain comes in a lot, and in dissolute sort of forms of how the images play out. On page 8, you'll see two forms that act as sort of a, tower, two towers. So 9/11 comes into play here a little bit, in this sort of architectural symbols of how, ideology, or the symbol of ideology, either through cenotaphic means, or the monument to an abstracted, drama or tragedy plays out, is found on page 8. Page 9 is a picture of an elephant that I threw in specifically to, to throw things off a little bit, depending on how close you read things. There's nothing really there with the zoo, unless you want to think about the zoo of ideology. Page 10, there's a two columnar sort of pictures of boots. This is what I call an audio picture. It's something where I'm not asking you to, think of, pictures of boots. I'm thinking you to think of the sound that boots make on cobblestone. Again, a reference to, obviously to Germany's history, Berlin's history in the war. The following page is, a kind of match for the elephant. It's just a bit of a drape on a bit of a strange iron handle, and it just kind of mimics the trunk of the elephant before. The following page is page 12. It's the first time where you see, the famous radio tower, radio term in Berlin. Alexander, Platz, and Fassbender gets in there. Everybody kind of gets in there on that symbol of this architectural, element. And it's the first picture where, it was a mistake when we were scanning negatives for the presentation of the workshop night, which happened following the end of the workshop with John. And it was a glitch that happened when we were scanning things, and it just seemed to make a lot of sense. Again, referring back to the sort of simulation, towards ideology, towards divisiveness, towards things, not arranging themselves in a linear um, and or perfect notion. You also notice the expansion of grain. Next page is blank, and then you have the Allianz Tower, which I believe is in Neukölln or somewhere very close to it. Which was, you have the kind of eagle, the Allianz eagle on the top right hand side of the building. It kind of factors in as this murkish sort of piece of architectural abstraction. It's imposing, it's rude, it's, priapic. There's a bunch of things about, the Allianz building, and moving towards ideas of capitalism, insurance, and in the way that ideology and economy work hand in hand together, as we see currently. Absolutely. Following page, which is technically page 15, is blank. Page 16 is another bit of a lark. I made that photograph walking back after having dinner with John Eva Maria Okabar in Berlin. Page 17 is a blank, 18 is a blank. This is not a function, a physical function. It's just a blank. And then you get to sort of um, the position on page 19 in which you see sort of a Turin shroud of a figure on an old piece of bedding that was actually just left out to hang. And that is kind of where we start to get into the specter and the haunting and the figurative idea, as I mentioned, the Turin shroud, but there's also sort of the idea of, hauntology. And Mark Fisher kind of pops up a lot in the sort of preamble to my interests in research about how I would want to think about Berlin. There's another book by somebody named Ladd, whose first name is evading me, called The Ghosts of Berlin. Brian Ladd, The Ghost of Berlin, which I actually read in like 2002 or 3 or something like that. But this idea of the ghosts along the landscape, and it's the same thing when you see the pictures of quote people within the book, the women. It's the idea of ghosts. It's the idea of the embodiment or disembodiment of actual people over that of ideology in the urban landscape, such as Berlin. When you get to page 21, there's kind of a junky sort of mass of nothingness, and that's actually it's a ATM. It's a bank service teller station where you withdraw cash. It's being renovated, but this whole jumble of things with this big black X placed over it kind of made a little bit of sense in talking about capital and ideology. And for the record, I don't know where I sit with any of this. Again, the idea with Dein Kampf is that I'm returning any sort of particular divisiveness or struggle or group identity of myself. I want to exist outside of it, not in this sort of anarchist sense, but in the sense of like I simply do not I benefit from all of these things. I benefit from history. I benefit from ideology that serves a purpose in which I was raised. I don't know if I necessarily agree with all of it. I'm, again, American, like I don't have a lot of sort of credibility when it comes to ideology, but I would say the same if I were Chinese. And so, or Russian or whatever. I just don't any time that the state operates on a mass influencing level and or that sort of religious dogma operates on a inculcating level on individuality. I'm certainly I'm looking for the exit. So, anyways, following with a page of blank and then following with this sort of viscous drip of black nebulous material down the side of the building, I almost 100% try to avoid the horror of graffiti whenever possible. But this is basically graffiti, and it's fine. Following a blank page and then technically page 25, some more glitch, page 26, nothing, page 27, again, sort of an ideological form of a strange picture of a Buddhist monk praying, a young Buddhist monk praying, that has been taken off of wherever it was used as an advertisement and placed over like a pallet full of cement to keep cement bags to keep them dry. It's sort of a weird meta Robert Gober hanging out in the landscape, and you don't see it right away. You have to look for the ear and the arm in order to get it. Again, playing with ideology. 28 nothing. 29 a bunch of bags of stuff, white stuff, shot outside of Berghain. And I've never been inside Berghain. I'm going to admit it now as a minimal techno fan and a metal dude and so on. I've never been inside, and it's probably for the better. Page 30 is just a fragment, a sort of 19th century fragment that was alongside a rail that I photographed while I was on the rail, not too far from the Allianz building, somewhere in Neukölln. It's a bit more breathing space on 31 and 32. 33 is a picture of a hospital, and it's a sort of all these white sort of towels are coming out of the hospital, and it's a rephotograph. It's a hospital in Kreuzberg, not far from where Peter and I were staying. And I photographed it because the appeal of the kind of white flags, as it were, hanging out the side of the hospital, almost as a response to giving up in ideological terms and or other, which is where I kind of feel myself with this body of work. 34 nothing. 35 is an interesting one because I can't remember if I actually shot it at the Topography of Terror site. I believe I did. There's been a fantastic book called Land's End by Drittel Books that came out about this site, which is a former SS headquarters, in effect, which they uncovered, which is now the Topography of Terror, which they uncovered and made a museum in. And one of the things that they had uncovered, one of the reasons that the city had made it into the Topography of Terror permanent exhibition space is that there was always a dispute as to whether or not there were actually Nazi torture cells somewhere on the premises. The building itself dated from the 19th century, but in the 1930s was taken over for the SS, and it was debated whether or not this happened. There was an archaeological dig, and in the 1950s or 60s, and they came up with nothing. There was no terror cells of sort of torture and execution. And then in the 1970s, it became another issue again. They wanted more talk about it. And finally, in the 1990s, they did another archaeological survey and indeed found the cells. And a bunch of people have photographed this site, which is why the Land's End book by Drittel Books exists, because Joachim Brome, John Gossage again, Schmidt, amongst others, had photographed the site as this question about how you deal with historical consciousness and memory, collective memory, and trauma. And it's one of the most pertinent and important sites in Berlin. And it's not very far from Checkpoint Charlie, or from where the Werkstatt for photography used to have their meetings. All of that is in a very specific area. Between East and West Berlin, and I cannot remember for the life of me. I remember shooting this photograph on page 35 of these sort of concrete cylinders there, but for the life of me, I can't confirm it. I think it was in the part that was later used after the war, was used as a weird sort of place where you could go drive cars if you didn't have a license. There's a whole backstory to this, which you can find in that aforementioned book. 36 nothing. 37, we revisit the hospital that had the flags out the windows, and this is more so that you can see the rain on the picture of the hospital from a different perspective without the white flags surrendering towards help or whatnot. And this is not obviously re-photography appropriation, but I wanted that sort of play of reality with a sort of enforcement of archival image to come through a little bit more. It's kind of a device that I think now in retrospect that Schmidt used in Einheit. He used the archival images, but he let it be seen that it was never meant to be a perfect substitute for what he was showing in history. So showing Nazi related material in Einheit Unity. You see the grain of the scanned book. You see the not the grain, but rather the sort of dot matrix of the printed page that he's scanned or photographed and blown up. And it's meant to play with history. It's meant to play with document. It's meant to play with the dissolve of meaning in terms of traumatic spheres of German history. And although mine isn't that pronounced because I don't come from that position, I wanted to play between the rain that graces the sort of placard in which I photographed and the thing itself, and also the shift in perspective. When you look architecturally, there's no way you can make that photograph easily unless you're in a helicopter on a tower. So continuing on, you get to page 39. There is a picture of a birch tree through what is a hole in the wall itself, the Berlin Wall, what's left of it. What's meant as a bit of a tourist trap, but also playing on the idea of the birch tree is something from Birkenwald and so on. So there's some sort of like historical signifiers and symbols that are in there that are not really pronounced upon, but if you're paying attention, you'll kind of pick up on it. 40 is a bit of this nebulous void of a tree, of a nebulous void or a shroud of history. 41 nothing. We have a double spread on 42 and 43 of this sort of weird rabbit hole or hole in this foliage that I just photographed and then stopped it down one to get a darker version of it. And you're literally going darker down the rabbit hole, as it were. 44, you have a picture of a big door, a key, a lock, an abstraction for meaning. Able to unlock meaning, I guess, is something that's a bit of a theme. Again, on zooming ahead on to page 47, more of the character people that are not real, but are sort of a fake sort of implementation of humanity in the simulacra sort of sense of things. 48 is not that. 48 is actually a picture of a Michael Schmidt picture from one day when John and the class of the workshop and myself and Michael Grieve visited the Schmidt archive, and it's actually a photograph through the tissue that laid on top of the print, which I believe is probably from Frauen, just looking at it. But the distortion and the reticulation of the grain when the negative has been blown up and distorted and stretched kind of gives it a darker sort of place. But yeah, so that's an actual, it's a Feuerhelm of a Schmidt. Moving forward, you have some more architectural things, blown out focus. That's supposed to be kind of a way to play with memory. It's a device that more people than myself have used. You have this idea of a door handle on page 52, and the idea there is just, again, as I mentioned before, the sort of audio picture of the boots on the cobblestones. Here you have the sort of more visceral, physical touch sense photograph of people who have historically touched a door handle, as ridiculous as that sounds. But this idea of inanimate objecthood, sort of transferring levels of inept historical value. These are observations and things that I believe that should be observed and qualified. The next page is sort of some brickwork with a shroud blowing out, kind of like somebody like a mouth blowing bubbles. But the brickwork is something that actually led me down a road that I'm considering now, is about sort of brick expressionism and German expressionist history as it plays out in architecture, and the way that brick is used and the way that mud is used to build edifice. And colossal, as Sobieski has pointed out, the edifice is colossal. Moving on, more architecture, a bit of the wall and a bit of a reflection that almost forms a cross. Again, on page 57, you get our, I think, third and final player of this portrait of this somber woman looking downwards, turned away, not real, nobody is real, such as nature on page 58. And then we scoot along to page 61, again, a bit more nature, the uprooted roots. Again, a sort of metaphorical leaning towards how we display methods of knowledge and what we consider are the roots of history, as it were. More ghosts on 62, 63. 64 is this picture of a water impregnated pillow that was found in the middle of a field. Something that is fecund, an object that is fecund with the possibility of alternate explanations, dreams, nightmares, and so forth. Moving forward, some more architectural stuff. Get to page 68 and 69. It's probably my favorite spread in the book. There's a little bit of a piss stain in an elevator, a glass elevator in a Berlin, actually where we were staying. It looks like a piss stain. It might not be. Maybe some child dropped their popsicle. I don't know. But in terms of formal composition, these two pages and the page following it, which has what looks like a star that belongs on an American flag, you'll find kind of hanging out there in this weird leather patched up duct tape sort of piece of information. More rubble on page 70. We're back to the radio tower on 71. 72, we have another flag for capitulation. 73, 74, nothing. 75, we get to the Wolfgang Tillmans picture, in so much is that it's called Neuwelt. And it's apparently a famous, in Neukölln, I believe. That day, I was really lost in a fugue state. So somebody had said, "Oh, the Neuwelt, that building, it's over in Neukölln, and it's blah 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 blah. It's social history and socialism and workers eating there." And I was like, "Oh, that's great." I have no idea, but Tillman's having the book called New World as well, who I'm a fan of. But also German history, 90s, things like that. That's not too much of a referent in the book, but I like the idea of playing with Huxley and things like that. On 77, you get this kind of void drain of binary 1001, 1001 numbers. Just kind of an idea, again, for numbers, capitalism, economy. 78, 79. 79 is sort of hospital architecture. This weird sort of temporary FEMA type sheds that, these sort of cargo container sheds, air conditioned, that there wasn't much in at the time. It seems like there's more in it now as I speak to you on April 2nd. 81, 82, sorry, 81 and 83 and 85 are the pictures in the book that kind of talk about this idea about ideology and wish fulfillment, and this idea that these black boxes, these spaces in which we put all of our desires to for what we want, for what we desire to see in our world, our solipsistic way of looking at things that are supposed to enable a camaraderie of sorts, play out in the black boxes. And on page 83, the Fotoausgabe in 4 Minuten is it's a bit of photographic background as well. It's a photo booth. It's got the black box in it. It's this promise of something in a short amount of time, which is also how ideologically we function on short promises. 85 is another black box in the way of a sort of barricade. And then finally on 87, we get the souvenirs picture, the gray picture of the closed souvenir shop, which is again, it's kind of you get the T-shirt kind of feeling about ideology. You get the coffee mug. You get the kind of, I signed up for this. I get the Che Guevara banner on my dorm room wall. Never been in a dorm room, but the feeling. The signing up for something that inevitably will only end in failure. And no matter what side of the spectrum you are on, humans and our catch-all need for being led and for leading by blanketing example of thought is one of the most cynically endearing traits of the species. The last and final thing I want to end out here with, after such a long bit of trying to sort of unpack my book a little bit for people who might not have heard about it or might not have seen it, is that I really wanted to work with Ulrich Bayer, who's who made an incredible book called Spectral Evidence about the landscape of trauma. And Michael Mack was kind enough. Michael knows everybody, and he knew Ulrich, and was kind enough to help in facilitating the essay, "The Rubble of History," also known as Berlin, by Ulrich, which was interesting because we kind of traded spots. I lived in Germany for a small amount of time, not in Berlin, but Ulrich has lived in America, for most of his life. German, but had lived there most of his life, and so his lens on Germany is completely different than my lens on Germany, and yet we seem to have exchanged continental, a continental disposition in terms of living, in terms of like experience. He's doing the American experience. I frankly have moved away from the American experience into the European experience, but yet we both cross over on a lot of the way that he saw immediately what I was doing. Maybe it's quite obvious, but I think he took a very undiminished and certainly apt series of observations historically between Benjamin, Krakauer, and just the general sort of political history of Germany and how Berlin works out, and how what I'm trying to install or infuse in the work between the sort of anxiety that I am looking to absorb in terms of historical anxiety, and the sort of way in which I'm looking to place myself in a particular era. Ulrich completely unpacked it. We spoke once on the phone. Super nice, lovely man. But he didn't, he was great. He unpacked it. He did it. He wrote a great essay. And, as somebody who writes, it's a sort of level of enthusiasm and command of second language, even that I find fascinating. And I couldn't be happier with both the experience with Mack and also with what Ulrich brought to the table. I think in a large sense, taking my initial ideas, which started with a series of inquiries and maquettes. I made 3 maquettes that I had shown. I was able to show Michael and the Mack team. I had made a bunch of maquettes of just the images and the full, formation of the book as an object. The cover is my sort of idea, but the full way in which it's designed and carried out between Morgan, Michael, and Michael's team it's really about. It's taking somebody who has an idea and a set of images and putting it into and making it an actual thing as opposed to just an idea of a thing. In any event, if you get a chance, check out my book, Dein Kampf. I'm super excited to have had the opportunity to work with the Team Mack, and I hope this has been, if long winded, a bit inspirational and informational. Thank you.